Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think I can follow up nicely on the talk by Cassie on the why we're using artificial intelligence. Indeed, my talk is going to be focused on why we should use it for healthcare solution. I'm a researcher, I come from an academic background, and just out of my curiosity, how many of you are in healthcare? We're very little. Okay, so I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. If I go too technical on the medical part, not really on the AI part, you're probably more experts than me there.
No, you should.
Just let me know later in the questions. So a little bit of background maybe on myself. I studied neuroscience here in Italy, and then I moved to ETH Zurich, where I did my PhD in neuroengineering. And during those studies, I primarily worked on the development of a device that I will show you later that artificially restores the sense of touch and decreases pain through the use also of AI and electrical nerve stimulation in patients with diabetic neuropathy. So after my studies, I did a little bit of postdoctoral research there, and I started a company, MYNERVA, which is quite young, but growing very fast. So, first of all, I would like to give this some boundaries. I mean, when we talk about AI and healthcare, the fields of application are infinite, probably. What we typically focus on is chronic diseases. So chronic diseases are the ones that last more than a year without being cured. And this, of course, can be cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and whatsoever. And this is a gigantic problem today, also because think that it's the leading causes of death and disability. In Europe, 86% of the deaths are due to a chronic disease. So it's a huge number, and of course, as you can see, the costs are simply gigantic. So here, AI might really play a role into helping us. But where do we really want to go? So when we talk about precision medicine, we also refer to this as a personalized medicine, is when we really want to try to focus on the best optimized treatment for that specific patient and for its characteristics. So recently, the focus on this is really big, and there's a lot of interest because previously the focus was more on doing a lot of research with big amounts of data and finding statistically what is the best solution for the average population. Today, also with the use of AI, we can really go towards something that is more individualized for the specific patient. So how do we typically get there? We could do this by having personalized treatments through measuring and monitoring. How do we do that? Through closed-loop systems. So what we can do is measure biometric-related information, which means, for example, your heart rate, your blood pressure, through simply probably what 80% of the people have here in this room, a smartwatch, okay? And then calibrating the treatment based on the data that we are collecting. So simply said, this is just sensing and then actuating based on the measurement that I have and changing the treatment based on what I've seen. So a little bit more into the focus of what our research has been doing. So we work with neuroprosthesis, so prosthesis for amputees, for diabetic patients. And one of the major things is, the topic is personalized calibration. Why? When you do prosthesis, so bionic prosthesis, the ones that are, for example, able to artificially restore your sense of touch, you typically work with electrical stimulation, which can be electrical stimulation of your peripheral nervous system, which means the nerves that get out of your spinal cord and innervate all your body, or you can do this centrally. Now, our focus is more peripherally, but in any case, in all of these things, you always need to do a very detailed calibration, because when you do electrical nerve stimulation, you elicit some sensation based on what electrodes, for example, you're activating. And this is specific for each patient. And after performing a surgery, you can do this also non-invasively. We'll see this later. You have to focus on the anatomy of the patient, the perceptual differences that they have. They have different thresholds, for example, of activation of the nerves. Then we have to take into consideration the time variability. Specifically, this is true when you implant electrodes in the nerves of patients. You usually have a lot of variations over time. Why? Because the electrodes can migrate, so they change position. And of course, if they change position, it means that inside of the nerves, they are not activating the same fibers. So the sensations that you restore are completely different over time. Yeah, as I said, movement of electrodes, but also adaptation. So adaptation is a process that typically happens always, because when you implant an electrode, after a few days, you simply get used to that threshold. So for example, I'm giving you a current here. After a few days, you simply won't perceive it anymore here, and you need to increase it. And this is always done manually. So we need to call back the patient to the hospital, do another calibration, which takes some hours, and then the patient can finally go home, which you understand is not sustainable on the long run. None of these patients will use these super cool and advanced technologies if every 2 days they have to come for 3 hours at the hospital. And finally, to adapt also to technological advancements. Today, we have multi-contact arrays, which is a very fancy word to say that you have electrodes that have a lot of active sites, so meaning where the current comes from. And you know, if you have thousands of these points where the electricity can come out of, it's very difficult to program such a system and perform a closed-loop system, as I said before, simply manually. We need to have an algorithm and some systems that adapt to what we're seeing in real time and adapt to the complexity of these systems. So yes, as I said, neurostimulation is extremely complex. It's our expertise. By the way, I didn't say I come from the Neuroengineering laboratory in ETH. And it's really time-consuming. And another thing that I didn't mention is that there's always an expert required. Whether it's an invasive procedure, so you need to do a surgery, or it's non-invasive, you always need to have an expert there, because you can imagine how these things are. It's done by, you know, super smart engineers, but it's super complex, and there's no way that a 70-year-old patient will be able to access the calibration modes to do it by themselves. So neurostimulation is not the only area where we can use artificial intelligence for calibration. One other example is DBS, which stands for deep brain stimulation. It's a technique that is used specifically for patients with Parkinson's disease to avoid the tremor. It really works extremely well, and basically what they do is they implant these electrodes that stimulate your brain, and based on the recordings that they have from your brain and the waves, the frequencies that they see, they can stimulate differently to avoid the tremor throughout life. Another one is FESS, which stands for functional electrical stimulation. This is stimulation not of the nerves, as I showed you before, but of the muscles. Epidural stimulation, maybe some of you have heard of this. This is a very hot topic recently. Basically, you insert the electrodes directly in the spinal cord and you stimulate the patient, typically for pain reduction. You have peripheral nerve stimulation, which is our expertise. By the way, this is a picture that we took from the surgery in our patients. You have intracortical stimulation. A bunch of research on this is done on monkeys because it's extremely complex to get ethical approvals for, you know, opening the brains of a person. Unless you're Elon Musk, it's very difficult. Vagus nerve stimulation, which is a new frontier specifically for diabetes, and finally optogenetics. Optogenetics, I think it's extremely interesting. It's how you control the activity of your neurons based on light. So by giving different types of light, you can activate the neurons to express certain ion channels, and this is extremely interesting. And you can use artificial intelligence also there to create these closed-loop systems. Now, what do we typically do when we want to test and validate these approaches, specifically also with the use of AI? Our approach is to do first modeling. So we create 3D models of the nerves, which with inside all the intrafascicular implants and all the fascicles, so that we can simulate in a virtual environment how it would be when we stimulate a specific patient with specific currents. After this, we go in animal models, so with monkeys, cats, mice, and we test the algorithms and the stimulation patterns that we validated in the modeling phase. And finally, we go in humans, which of course can be either off or online. Offline means that first I record the data from the patients after I stimulate them, and then I create the models and see whether I can perform better with models that I created. Online, of course, I do everything online. The algorithms work on the patient, and we see what happens. So one of the processes and models that can be used are Bayesian optimization. So Bayesian optimization typically models the unknown function as a random function and assigns it to a prior distribution. Then at each iteration, a new response is learned, and a posterior distribution is built based on the data observed, conditioning the prior. So what means for the neuroprosthetic example is exactly the same thing, but the data in input and output are, for example, the EMG activation, so electromyography activation, which is the activation of your muscles, and the pulse width there on top, the pulse width and the pulse amplitude of the stimulation, which just means the current that I am injecting. So based on what I read, I change the current that I'm injecting. So this is, for me, a very interesting study by Bonizzato this year. It's really interesting because they do epidural stimulation of mice and monkeys to restore gait functions. So for those who are not aware of this, typically in these poor animals, you create like a lesion in the spinal cord and the animal is not able to walk anymore. And then what you do is you implant electrodes in their body and you stimulate them. And you see whether by stimulating them in the brain or in the body, you can restore the walking function. So yes, monkey and mice, and here what they used is Gaussian process-based Bayesian optimization. And what usually happens here is that the Gaussian process Bayesian optimization model operates by performing a series of queries following a pattern that slowly converges over some hotspots. But rather than complex models, let me show you a video of what this means. So here you see a mouse walking, yes. You see that the mouse is walking really bad because it has this lesion on the spinal cord. But the more the optimization agent learns a new combination and the more it converges, the more the mouse is able to walk with a normal pattern. So for example, now the walking is restored, and if we compare the now and when he just started, you really see the difference in the gait. And this is done through electrical nerve stimulation and artificial intelligence. Now, I would like now to focus more on what we have been doing specifically in the neuroengineering laboratory. So initially we started working with amputees and we started artificially restoring the sense of touch in amputees. I would like to show you a video of how this works, but first let me explain why this is even important. So when you typically have an amputation, while you walk, you can't perceive the ground under your feet. So this means that you constantly need to visually control where you're putting your feet, because otherwise you fall, and this means injuries, and this means hospitalization, which is bad not only for the patient, but for the whole healthcare system, because it means increased costs. So basically what we did is, this is the system, and here you see the amputee walking a little bit with a strange gait. So we put a sensorized insole under the foot of the patient, and we capture in real time the force exerted by the subject. This information is then sent to an electrode, which is implanted into the sciatic nerve of the patient, and by stimulating the fascicles, this can artificially restore the sense of touch because it recreates the sensations not where the electrode is on the thigh, but directly under the phantom foot. So this is sometimes very strange to understand, I know, but bear with me. So just to wake you up a little bit, this is exactly what we did on patients. So we implanted 4 electrodes in the sciatic nerve. Each electrode had 54 active sites, which means 54 places where the electrode, the current can be injected. This was not a completely fully wearable system. Indeed, as you can see here, the cables were coming out, and this is what typically happens in research, because these amputees, they kept the system for 6 months, and then they were fully explanted. Now, this is what I meant before. When you stimulate the electrodes and the sciatic nerve in the thigh, the amputee doesn't have the leg, okay? They feel the sensations under the phantom foot. Why? Because we are activating a specific portion of the nerves that are traveling not only down, but directly to our brain. And in our brain, we have what's known as the homunculus of Penfield. This is there's a nice image, if you Google this, about the fact that in our somatosensory and our motor cortices, we have a complete map of our body. So for example, when you move your right hand, or when you think about moving your right hand, your neurons in a specific area of your brain, and it's like this for each and every one of us, activate. And this is also the concept that, for example, brain-computer interfaces are based on. You know, think about moving your right hand, I can switch on the lights if, of course, I set up the system. So by doing this, we are able to elicit the sensations directly under the plantar part of the foot. And given that we had so many active sites, we were able to restore very small sensations. So you can understand that while the patient is walking, he doesn't need to look down anymore because the whole system does it for him if he perceives the things under the prosthesis. These are just the sensations that we elicited. So for example, it's true that it's not always a touch sensation, but definitely touch, pressure, pulsation, vibration can be perceived as a natural perception. Sometimes you go into electricity, which is not necessarily what you want, but this is just what happens sometimes. And this is just interesting because we were able to restore some sensations also on the calf, which looked to the patients as calf contraction, which we use as a proprioceptive feeling. Proprioception is when you, for example, hold your hand like this and even not looking at it, you know where it is in space, or the reason why you can perform this even with your eyes closed. So we did this, and they perceived that sensation as their knee bending. So this means, for example, when they were doing the stairs, they knew when the knee was bent or when it was completely on, again, avoiding the risks of falls. Okay, so this is a patient that we had just operated. And you see that the prosthesis is completely detached from his body. If you notice, he's blindfolded and acoustically isolated. And we have our insole that I showed you in the video before. And these little things here are pressure sensors. So if the system works, if we were to touch these sensors, he would be able to perceive the sensations directly under the foot. Now, we gave him a foot, and we asked him to tell us what he perceived. It's in Serbian. He perceives it exactly there. And the prosthesis is detached from his body. This is a placebo, so we were not touching him. And he feels nothing. We touch the other sensor. He feels it instantaneously. So this is a closed-loop system in real time. This works when the patient is walking. Okay, so Artificial intelligence here came in a little bit later, because when we did the trials, we did not use AI algorithms for the calibration phase. This is why these patients had to come every 2 days in the hospital to redo the calibration, which, bad thing for the patient, good thing for us now because we had a lot of data. So what we said is, let's see if we can, a posteriori, build some models that can predict what changes during the calibration phase. Indeed, we saw, and this is data from the patients, that there's a location migration in where the patients perceive the sensation. So this picture here shows you that the same electrode that in day 1 was activating sensations on the heel, in the 3rd month it was completely up, so completely different. So it means we cannot keep the same stimulation patterns for the whole 3 months. They will just get confused. And also the threshold of activation changes, remember, because of adaptation. So after 3 months, we had to increase the amount of charge that we injected. So also here, using Gaussian GPBO, so I'm quicker this time, we were able to remap and see how the sensations changed over time. So we were able to predict the changes that the active sites had in time. But not only, we were also able to predict the change in the perceptual threshold, as you can see here, which means that if we are able to do these things before, and of course have enough data in the beginning that we could use to future patients that will have these implants, we're going to be able to avoid the fact that every 2 days they come to the hospital. We will simply use these algorithms and the prosthesis will function by itself. Now, another thing, another topic that we've been strongly working on, especially also at MYNERVA, is diabetic neuropathy. Now, when I talk about diabetes, most of you typically think about glucose control and glucose monitoring, right? Now, the fact is that not everybody knows about the silent killer, they call it like this, that is neuropathy. Neuropathy is simply a damage of the nerves. So your nerves start dying. Why in diabetes? Because diabetes with high levels of glucose doesn't allow the oxygen to travel well through your vessels. So this means that if the oxygen doesn't arrive in your nerve endings, your nerves are going to die. And what are the consequences? First of all, same thing as in amputees, sensory loss. So sensory loss means, as we saw before, increased risk of falling, injury, and hospitalization. This is a diabetic patient walking, and you see that they're completely unstable. So sensory loss is typically treated with physiotherapy, which, however, cannot restore any of the lost sensations, but just provide some compensatory strategies. And at the same time, this neuropathy, so the damage of the nerve, causes chronic pain, which doesn't allow these patients to sleep at night. It's really a gigantic problem. And for this, they're prescribed with opioids. Probably some of you have heard about the huge opioid crisis that has been going on everywhere, especially in the United States, which are basically the legal version of heroin. So they have a never-ending list of side effects, such as addiction, nausea, constipation, problems with the sleep. So the treatment of these patients is not optimal at all, as it is right now. And unfortunately, also, this is a huge healthcare problem because the expenses for these fragmented paths are gigantic, and we need to find a solution to, make all patients have a single solution that restores sensory feedback and decreases pain. And we can do that through neurostimulation. How do we do this? So you will see here a system that is similar to the one that I showed you for the amputees, because the basic principle is the same. We're always using electrical nerve stimulation to artificially restore the sense of touch, in this case also to decrease pain. Now, why am I saying to decrease pain? Why would you think that electrical nerve stimulation decreases pain? And to say this, I usually make this example. So think about when you bump your head or your knee somewhere. What is the first thing that you want to do? You rub the area, right? Now, stop for a moment and think about, it makes no sense that you would like to rub the area that you just hurt. You would just want to leave it alone, right? The reason why you touch the area is because touch activates large diameter fibers that travel to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And here they activate this little inhibitory interneurons that inhibit the pain pathway. Now, our stimulation with the electrodes, where we put them, the intensity that we're using, and the frequency that we're using, is able to activate exactly those large diameter fibers. So this is why we can have pain decrease. But let's look more at the system. So here you see patients. This is a diabetic patient, typically in pain, and while they walk, because they can't perceive their feet, they fall. So the concept is similar. We capture pressure-related information, but here instead we send it to a smart stimulation sock that, by activating healthy portion of the nerves, is able to restore sensations under the plantar part of the foot, not at the ankle. Yeah, we built a smartphone application, and here is where you have the calibration with the AI algorithms that are able to restore the sensation. And this allows to artificially restore the sense of touch in real time, and for the reason I told you before, decrease pain. Now here, instead of what we did before, we used artificial intelligence, but not a posteriori, but a priori. So we used the reinforcement learning to try to optimize not only the time needed for this procedure, but also the characteristics, and really drive it towards a personalized treatment. So make sure that each single algorithm that is driving this electrical nerve stimulation is tailored to each specific patient. And first of all, we saw that, so we built this reinforcement learning algorithm. We had an expert doing the calibration. We had a naive person doing the calibration. And we compared it to a brute force algorithm. And what we saw was that the reinforcement algorithm was much faster in performing the calibration, which means much more possibility that the patients are going to actually use the device in future. And then we saw also, we compared this also with healthy patients, and we saw that the time needed for the patients was slightly larger, but importantly, the charge injected was much higher. Why? Because if the nerves are dying, then I need much more current to stimulate the nerves because they are slowly dying, so I need something stronger. All of this to arrive to a patient. This is just one example, and this was actually, I think, the second or the third patients that we were testing with our very first prototype. So she's going to talk in German, because again, I live in Zurich, but there are going to be subtitles down. And what you will see here is that on the left, yes, she's using the system on, and on the right, she's using the system off. And what we asked her was to walk on a straight line by simply looking at it. And this was the first time that she was using the system, so no training whatsoever.
Ich habe heute diese Tests gemacht, mit und ohne Stimulation zu laufen. Und ich muss sagen, das gerade Auslaufen, das einfache gerade Auslaufen, was mir schwerfällt, weil ich immer so die Beine so ein bisschen unkoordiniert bewege, ist mir mit der Stimulation viel leichter gefallen. Ich habe auch das Gefühl, ich bin viel gerader gegangen. Ich kann es nicht erklären, warum. Ich habe einfach das Gefühl, dass ich meine Beine besser spüre. Wirklich das Gefühl, mir gehören meine Beine jetzt etwas mehr.
And this was also the first time that in 15 years she did the stairs without holding onto the rails. So we were extremely happy of this. And this is also what MYNERVA is based on. So we really are striving forward to help these patients. Now, what I would like to close with is just a hint of some of the additional research that we're doing in the laboratory, always using artificial intelligence. And this particularly relates to pain measurement. So pain happens in a lot of wide range of diseases. So it can happen in chronic, in cancer, it can happen in toothache, in bellyache, headache, diabetes, wherever. And it has a psychological and an emotional component to it. Because today, if I ask you how strong is your pain, you will tell me 7, but maybe you will tell me 8. But how do I know that yours is actually stronger than his? It's extremely subjective, because in this number, you have not only an objective component to it, but you have also your psychological things that are not only what do I mean as 8, but also do I really want to seek medical attention? I'm going to say a higher number. Some cultures are ashamed of pain, so they will say a lower number. So what we do today is have subjective measurements, which makes no sense. And on the other side, uninformed experiments. We try to experimentally induce pain, which we did with patients, and then we ask them their number, maybe based on biomarkers. But then there's today no reliable biomarkers. A biomarker is just a sign in your body that tells me, okay, you have pain. You can look at the brain, you can look at alpha, beta, delta, theta frequencies and see how they're distributed. You can see at your heart rate going up, which means that maybe you have an acute pain. But there is nothing that really tells me that that is pain, because your heart rate goes up even when I scare you. So that's not a biomarker of pain. So what this ends with are genetic therapies. I say I have pain, the doctor doesn't know if my pain is really objective, so I will just prescribe opioids. They work, the patient likes them. So, by the way, 80% of the deaths because of heroin are due to an initial prescription of opioids. What we would like to achieve is something that looks more like this. So we would like to have a telemonitoring system where the patient says, okay, my pain is out of 10. Then think about having like a wearable device where the patient tells you, my pain is 8, but I'm measuring their biometric data. Then we could use all this as a psychological assessment. We could keep a sleep diary. We can have all these measurements, feed it into an AI-based engine, and then what we want to achieve is to disentangle the contribution that the physical and the emotional component have in the pain perception. Why? To arrive to a personalized therapy where I see that if the patient has a higher component of psychological pain, I will prescribe, now I'm making an exaggeration here, but just to make you understand, psychotherapy instead of giving opioids to this patient. So we already started working towards this. We tested 118 subjects, measured a bunch of different psychological things. We did physiological measures, meaning we experimentally induced pain in these patients that already had chronic pain. I know we're bad people, but we did this. And we asked them to answer how strong was the pain. Already, an interesting thing to notice here is that the stimulus that we were applying, which was through a thermode, so it was a heat pain, was always the same intensity. But look at the difference in the answers from the patients. They're receiving always the same stimulus, but the answers are completely different among the patients, but also inside of the same patient, they change. So it's, subjective measures cannot work. So what we did then was we recorded the EEG recordings and a skin conductance measure. It's how much you sweat. Typically when you are in pain or when you are scared, your conductivity increases because you start sweating, so the electricity flows better through your skin. We did some pre-processing of both the recordings, and we did some feature extraction and some feature selection. All of this to arrive more to the AI part, where as a first step, we wanted to verify whether we were at least able to distinguish a painful situation from a non-painful situation. So we took the recordings from when we were giving pain and when they were not having pain of these EEG and skin conductance recordings, so only the physical measures. We applied AI algorithms and we tried to see what happened. After that, we extracted some pain biomarkers. Here, probably all of you know SHAP, but we used the SHAP to extract which of these biomarkers were the most important for the prediction of pain versus no pain. And then in the end, we extracted this subjective index of pain, which is by applying mixed effect multi-level models and feeding them not only the pain biomarkers that we found, but also the psychological components, we were able to disentangle the physical and the psychological contribution. Now, I don't have results on this. I know I was keeping you waiting, but the results are still not published, so I can't spoiler too much. We just submitted the article, so we hope that sometime soon it will happen. But in the meantime, I would really like to thank the Neuroengineering Laboratory. They're amazing people. Even though I've moved to the startup, they've really been together with me during the whole PhD, and all of this would not have been possible without them. So thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. That was great. Brilliant. Wow, that's really amazing work that you're doing. We do have time for several questions. So if you would like to raise your hand, the floor is yours. Yes, we have one over here. Thank you.
My name is Paulina. Thank you very much for the great talk. So actually, I have two short questions. So first of all, when you collaborate with some physicians, so I guess this is difficult because you have some people from IT fields, some from physicians. So what is the advice, how to deal with such interdisciplinary teams? And the second one about the ethics. So how difficult it is to start such research? Do you need to get some agreement from committees to actually start it? Thanks.
So thank you for the questions. As for the first question, absolutely. It's extremely difficult to talk with physicians because they always also never have time, ever. So what I typically like to do is to create some sort of workshops so they don't need to give you too much of their time, and it's also their interest in networking with other physicians. So, you can do that in your laboratory. You can ask maybe somebody that's supporting you to give you a space, and you invite them over dinner. Invite them over dinner, doesn't matter. And you create just a round table where people talk. This is extremely interesting, especially for more senior people. The only advice I would give you there is try to take people of the same caliber, because when you start taking extremely nice experts, the ones that are a little bit down in the food chain, they're not going to talk because they're going to be afraid of expressing their ideas, even though maybe it might be the good idea because it's the new, And for the second question, so for the ethics, it's a long procedure. I can talk about Switzerland. I don't know about other countries. So in Switzerland, what you typically do is you send like a brief description to the Cantonal Ethics Commission, and each canton of Switzerland has its own, and they will tell you, yes, it's my responsibility because, I don't know, maybe you're opening the brain of your patients, yes, it's their responsibility. Otherwise, if they say that it's not as risky as a procedure, you go directly to the Ethics Commission of your institution, in my case, ETH Zurich, and they will approve it.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question here.
Hi, my name is Martina. It was super interesting. It was a great presentation, so thank you. I have a question. So when you're saying that you separate, like you were able to separate the pain between the emotional and the physical part, that kind of like changes the whole definition of pain itself, right? Because like you're disentangling physically what happens to you with your feelings, right? It's like, I'm kind of confused by that.
No, that's an excellent question, actually, because, one could tell you, but pain is subjective. So what's the point? No, if you're telling me that you're perceiving a 7, it is a 7, so why would I care? It's not necessarily true, because there is, as we said, your body tells you about your pain. So you have signatures of your pain in your body. What you cannot do is, if you rely only on these pain biomarkers, they will probably tell me that your pain is a little bit lower or a little bit higher. So when I go towards using numerical rating scales, my pain is a 7, I cannot use only that number or only the physical components, because none of the two will really tell me how much is your objective subjective pain, so how much your body is telling about your pain. Then if we talk about the psychological component, one thing that you could argue with me is, yes, and this is actually true, it has been shown that physical, psychological thinking about pain, so like catastrophizing pain, has actually an effect on your physical structure, on your body. So only your psychology is changing how your body perceives pain. And in that case, I would say, okay, then I totally agree with you. There would not be the need for something like this, but this is not the case. So this is why you need to know what your body has in terms of pain, and then the delta between that number and what you are actually saying by voice, that can only be psychological, can't be anything else. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, yeah, kind of. But I've like, my other doubt is like, does that not depend as well on like what you were talking about, the threshold, right? So if you've been exposed to more pain throughout your life, maybe your body, as you're saying, readjusts to it. So psychologically, you perceive it as less because your threshold has gone up, right?
Yeah.
So, and
Indeed.
in that case, for example, physically, maybe your pain is lower than a patient who's never exposed to that stimulus, for example. However, would you quantify that as lower? Like, does the model account for that?
Yes, I would still quantify it as lower because your body is saying that your pain is lower. I mean, pain still remains always subjective. It's not like we really don't want to say the same stimulus should be perceived in the same way by everybody. This is absolutely wrong. What is right is every stimulus is different by every person physically, but then also on top of this, you have psychological components that we can, at least separate to see what's the best therapy for the patient.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to move on, but thank you so much. Give her a big round of applause.
Thank you.